Hey there, so here's a claim that many people don't believe, or are skeptical of. The forces of reason and rationality allow us to behave more morally. Or, to put that another way, science and reason can tell us right from wrong. And not only that, but reason can extend our empathy. What are you talking about? I hear you saying. You suffer from brain damage? Surely our conscience is what makes us moral, right? Now, before you just tune me out as crazy, hear me out. First, we're going to need to define some terms, so that if you do choose to disagree with me, we can have a decent conversation about it, rather than just yelling expletives back and forth at one another. When I say reason, I mean the use of logic and rationality, as well as using evidence which informs our cognitive processes when making a decision, or the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. If each of us objects to our own suffering, how can we rationally, logically, coherently maintain that the suffering of another individual is good? This is equivalent to maintaining that you are a uniquely important and special person in the universe above all others. Everyone else has a brain that interprets pain signals just like you do, so the process of reason allows us to understand that the pain of others is a negative. If I object to being stabbed, I cannot then run around stabbing other people, saying, hey, you should be okay with this because you're you and I'm me. Furthermore, if you are beginning to mount arguments against the effectiveness of reason, note that you are using reason to do so. You are arguing against reason using reason itself. You are forming logical arguments, and in doing so, admitting reason's effectiveness. Now, obviously, it's true that reason is a means to an end. If the reasoner likes cruelty and chaos, reason can be applied to achieve cruelty and chaos. However, reason applied to human flourishing can lead to less cruelty and a better, more peaceful society overall. Now, this depends on two things. First, that the person reasoning cares for his or her own well-being. And I mean, who doesn't? And that they are a member of a community of other reasoning individuals who can trade thoughts and ideas. This is called the marketplace of ideas, and it allows reason to facilitate the application of empathy to an entire community. Empathy allows us to consider things from another person's point of view, to understand their feelings and their suffering. But it is often biased towards family members and close friends. It is biased towards babies and cute animals. We've evolved to have more empathy for these individuals, to have a sense of fairness and justice within small communities. The problem was famously written about by Adam Smith, who used the example of a hypothetical earthquake in China to highlight the indifference we can have to the suffering of others outside this circle, focusing instead on personal tragedies or problems in our immediate vicinity, regardless of the severity of the issue. Let us suppose that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. And let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would be affected upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all, express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life, and the vanity of all the labors of man which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into the many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce on the commerce of Europe and the trade and the business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion, with the same ease and tranquillity as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall him tomorrow would occasion a more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight, but, provided he never saw them, he will snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. When we are always so much more deeply affected by whatever concerns ourselves than whatever concerns other men, what is it which prompts the generous, upon all occasions, and the mean upon many, to sacrifice their own interests to the great interests of others? It is not that soft power of humanity, it is not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lighted up in the human heart, that is capable of counteracting the strongest impulses of self-love. It is a stronger power, a more forcible motive, which exerts itself upon such occasions. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. The favoring of personal tragedies over horrors far from us is very natural, effective, and to some extent necessary. Imagine if you reacted to the misfortune of others with the same intensity that you would have if the event happened to you. You'd never be able to leave your house because every time you heard about a car accident on the news, you'd go into hysterics. But Smith was right that if the overall human condition is to improve, we must accept the strength of reason. Reason expands our circles of empathy out to our communities, our cities, states, country, and possibly even all of humanity. Every expansion of civil rights, the African American civil rights movement, women's rights, children's rights, gay rights, animal rights, were all inspired by reasoned arguments from thinkers who highlighted why some practice was immoral or wrong. They called out the hypocrisy in between how people wanted to be treated and how they treated others. They brought out the cognitive dissonance buried in society by highlighting the logical inconsistencies in these practices. And the truth is that people like to reduce cognitive dissonance when they're confronted with it. Reasoned arguments for rights begin with intellectuals, thinkers, and moral philosophers whose ideas get spread around society. They penetrate society, inspire changes and social reform, and after enough time has passed, they become part of the social norm. Does anyone today feel the need to put forth a formally constructed argument for why slavery is wrong? No, for it has gone from being an example of analytic or reasoned thinking to being an example of intuitive or holistic thinking. But philosophical arguments against slavery were made in the past. One of the most famous arguments against slavery came from John Locke. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what that legislative shall enact, according to the trust put in it. Freedom, then, is not what Sir Robert Filmer tells us, a liberty for every one to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society, and made by the legislative powers erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things, what the rule prescribes not, and not to be subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. My apologies for the somewhat archaic and Byzantine language, but, it's what he wrote. Perhaps if he were around today, he would have written it with emojis. But what Locke was getting at is that the natural freedom of man is to be free from ownership by another man. Even the outlawing of torture or cruel and unusual punishments comes from an argument made by Cesare Beccaria, an Italian jurist. No man can be judged a criminal until he be found guilty. Nor can society take from him the public protection until it has been proved that he has violated the conditions on which it was granted. What right, then, but that of power, can authorize the punishment of a citizen so long as there remains any doubt of his guilt? This dilemma is frequent. Either he is guilty or not guilty. If guilty, he should only suffer the punishment ordained by the laws, and torture becomes useless, as his confession is unnecessary. If he be not guilty, you torture the innocent, for in the eye of the law every man is innocent whose crime has not been proved. Crimes are more effectually prevented by the certainty than the severity of the punishment. In proportion as punishments become more cruel, the minds of men, as a fluid, rises to the same height with that which surrounds it, grow hardened and insensible, and the force of the passion still continuing in the space of 100 years, and the wheel terrifies no more than formerly the prison. That a punishment may produce the effect required, it is sufficient that the evil it occasions should exceed the good expected from the crime. Including in the calculation the certainty of the punishment, and the privilege of the expected advantage, all severity beyond this is superfluous, and therefore tyrannical. Beccaria's claim that punishments should only be harmful enough to counteract anything gained by committing the crime take on another level of persuasiveness once you apply some logic to realize that if punishments are not calibrated, and a universal punishment is imposed across the board, then one might as well commit the maximum possible crime since there could be no greater punishment. Deterring greater crimes only works if punishments are calibrated to the severity of the offense. Ideas about the horror of war and its wastefulness were put forth first by Erasmus, a Dutch theologian who wrote that the advantages derived from peace diffuse themselves far and wide, and reach great numbers, while in war, if anything turns out happily, the advantage redounds only to a few, and to those unworthy of reaping it. One man's wealth at the cost of another's, one man's safety at the cost of another's, etc. And they were carried on by people like Immanuel Kant, who would go on to write an essay entitled Perpetual Peace, where he would lay out 6 points to act as a guide for the nation-states of the world to come to peace. And simple reason dictates conflict more wasteful than cooperation. And experiments like Robert Axelrod's computer tournament of The Prisoner's Dilemma confirms this, where the winning strategies of computer programs pitted against one another in a game of trust and deception, won by eliciting behavior that allowed both programs to do well, thus accumulating more overall points during the duration of the tournament. Let's return for a moment to the arguments against slavery. James Otis, a Massachusetts lawyer during the Revolutionary era, would argue against slavery in his 1764 essay, writing that, "The colonists are by the law of nature born free, as indeed all men are, white or black. What man is or ever was born free, if every man is not." And similar arguments were made for feminist movements, as in 1700 Mary Estelle wrote in Some Reflections Upon Marriage, "If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? If absolute sovereignty be not necessary in a state, how comes it to be so in a family? Or if in a family, why not in a state? Since no reason can be alleged for the one that will not hold more strongly for the other. If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of men be the perfect condition of slavery." If these words sound at all familiar, it is because of the similarity in the reasons behind the arguments. Arguments for the expansion of rights to one group inspires another because the logic is the same. Because you cannot maintain that one group should be free while another should not be. And no doubt future generations will look back on ours, shocked by practices we deem acceptable at the moment, but which reason tells us is wrong, which should inspire us to examine our actions and work to change them if something is wrong. And so once again we see that reasoned arguments infiltrate society over time, before becoming part of the social norm. And when reason is combined with scientific knowledge, such as the knowledge of how our brains work, or that an accident doesn't occur because of a witch, then we can treat people more morally. And what about empathy? Empathy allows us to feel the pain of others, and it is a fantastic tool. But it is blind to facts and figures which should be taken into consideration when choosing how to help people. It is biased to those close to us, and it is weak when dealing with large numbers. In an article by Paul Slovich, he discusses the effect of the identifiable victim, and notes that we are more likely to be moved into action upon seeing the suffering of one person. But as the numbers of victims presented to us increases, we are less affected and less likely to act. Reason not only expands our circles of empathy, but helps us tailor our emotions into useful, practical actions that will help the most number of people most efficiently. If we want to improve the world, empathy will have to be tempered with reason, and reason must be accepted as a way to guide us morally and ethically. So, the next time you get an urge to do something morally questionable, stop and check in with your brain. Apply some reason, because you might find it pays off. Not just for you, but for everyone.